On this day, Frisians around the world have a day of celebration of their culture, heritage and language in remembrance of a battle that took place on the 26th of September 1345. This took place at a small town in Fryslân called Warns, and it's been celebrated since 1945 and continues to be celebrated to this day, with various speakers and Frisians from all over Frisia meeting at this place of Warns to celebrate a battle that occurred there in the 14th century. And in today's video, I'd like to ask, why is this battle so important for modern Frisians today? As I've mentioned in other videos, Frisia was a historical region that spread from the borders of Belgium right the way up through the coastal areas of the Netherlands and Germany. This region by around 800 had largely been incorporated into the Carolingian or Frankish Empire. However, for much of the 9th century, this region would partially be ruled by Danish or Viking warlords working for these Frankish rulers rather than by native Frisians themselves. This situation would change in 884 when the last of these Danish rulers was killed. His name was Godfred, and he was killed possibly by Gerulf, who was a Frisian nobleman himself, who was then made the Count of West Frisia. However, within about a century in 993, one of his descendants, Arnulf, would himself be in conflict with the local Frisians over how much power these new counts actually had over the Frisian population. By around 1100, these counts of West Frisia have a new name for themselves, and they become known instead as the Counts of Holland, and a distinction can be drawn between the Hollanders in the area of southern North Holland and South Holland today, and the Frisians, who lived further in the north of North Holland and across the sea in Frisia, as we can see on this map. Now, this conflict would largely be fought in an area called West Friesland in Dutch, which is actually part of the modern province of North Holland, because there were still Frisians living there in that region during the Middle Ages. One of the more famous attempts to do this was in 1256, when the Count of Holland, Willem II, who had also just been elected to become the Holy Roman Emperor, so the only Dutch Holy Roman Emperor in history, he decided to attempt to subjugate the Frisians in West Friesland by going and attacking them in the winter. But instead, he was lured onto the ice on his horse by the Frisians, and depending on the story, either sank into the ice and drowned or was clubbed to death whilst he was prone in this icy water by the Frisians. However, his son Floris V would also try and capture this region. Now, he was very much aided by the fact that in 1288 there was a huge flood called the St. Lucia flood, in which possibly hundreds of thousands of people drowned, and this so severely weakened the region of West Frisia that he was quite quickly able to capture it and incorporate it into the county of Holland. From this point on, the Hollanders weren't done with capturing areas of Frisia, however, and they soon turned their attention to the region of Middle Frisia, shown here in yellow, which was across the Zuiderzee, that inland sea from the area of West Friesland that they had just captured. Already in 1310, the Frisians promised to accept him as their count in name as long as he stayed out of their region of Frisia and didn't demand more from them in terms of taxation and in terms of recognizing overlordship. However, by 1323, the Frisians could see that this wasn't going to work and that Willem was just slowly trying to gain more and more power on the other side of the Zuiderzee, and so open conflict broke out between them. Part of the reason why the Counts of Holland had such a hard time subduing the Frisians was that because, unlike most other places in Europe at the time, in Frisia there was a phenomenon called the Frisian freedom, in which people and the Frisian region itself was subject only to the Holy Roman Emperor rather than to various counts and other feudal lords in between the emperor and the people itself. There were a class of nobles in Frisia at this time called Hadlingen, but they really didn't have as much power as counts in other parts of Europe, and so there is no feudal system in Frisia, meaning that it was incredibly hard to conquer and incredibly hard to rule over, as pretty much everyone was on a somewhat equal footing, even if it's more complicated in the details. This meant that Frisia provided a very difficult target for annexation by these counts of Holland, because they couldn't just kill the count and then take power. They had to constantly fight against the most powerful factions that they encountered in Frisia. Now the count to try and do this was Willem IV, or William IV. He was the Count of Holland at this time, and he was quite a successful and formidable fighter already by the time of 1345. If we take a look at his life, he was the Count of Holland, of Hainaut and Zeeland, and through marriage connections he also had quite a lot of a say in Brabant as well. He was the brother-in-law of Edward III of England, and he fought against the French in the 100 Years' War at some of the more famous engagements there. He also went on crusade against the Prussians in what is today Lithuania and the Baltic states on 3 separate occasions, and we know that he also went to the Holy Land to fight against the Saracens in crusades there. Finally, he also took part in La Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, fighting in Spain and in Portugal against the Moors there. So by this time he was already a seasoned commander and fighter, and was a respected military leader in his own right. And so he thought that the Frisians, with their peasant armies, would probably make for an easy target for conquest and the expansion of his county. In order to do this, he assembled an army of several thousand of the best knights that he could find. These were knights from his native Holland, as well as his holdings in Zeeland and one can imagine in Brabant, but also some from Flanders and from France as well, places where he had been fighting and had connections, as well as we can imagine maybe also hiring mercenaries for the task of capturing Middle Frisia and subjugating it. These were your classic knights of the 14th century, many of whom had just come back from crusade and so were quite experienced fighters, which is what you need when starting such a campaign. Now it would be in 1345 that he would make his famous bid to conquer Middle Frisia for once and for all, and he would set sail on the 26th of September 1345. They would leave the port of Enkhuizen, or Enkhuizen in Dutch, and set sail for the region of het Gasterland in Frisia. It's the part that was closest to North Holland, so it makes sense to sail there. He also knew that they had been preparing for a Dutch attack there for some time, and so what he did was to split his force. Some of them would follow his uncle's command, John of Beaumont, who would sail around the coast and land at a place called Laaksum, quite close to where there was a monastery at the time. Willem, on the other hand, would go and sail to Starum, or Stavoren in Dutch, and from there land, and so they would hopefully have a pincer attack that would encircle the Frisian army that they knew was somewhere on this side of the sea, and then be able to defeat them one by one. The Hollanders were unopposed and were able to land, pushing through the landscape and burning everything in their path until they reached the area around Warns, and this is where they were set upon by the Frisian army that had been waiting in ambush. A quick note about the army is that that's quite a loose term. We know that the Frisians were militarized at this point, but whether it was a real army with a command structure is harder to tell. We're probably talking more about a few Hartlingen, so more like knights or these nobles in Frisia, though not quite the same as counts, but largely about the common population, fishers and farmers, coming out with any weapons that they might have lying around, fish hooks or reaping hooks, scythes and that kind of thing, axes, to fight back against the Hollanders. And this furious onslaught seems to have been quite effective, as at Warns, Willem was no longer able to move forwards and instead started to be pushed back by this Frisian attack. Pushed back to an area called het Reaklif, which in Frisian is the Red Cliff, and is a sort of cliff face, not particularly high, but a kind of cliff area around the sea, and the Hollanders were being pushed back towards this cliff. Now, around the same time, his uncle, John of Beaumont, has landed slightly further south with another contingent of men. And from there they have captured the monastery of St. Odulfus. Now this was possibly a location where the Frisians were trying to build a kind of fortification, as it was quite a tactical area. But it seems that during the conquest of this monastery, some of the monks may have been wounded or killed, and this infuriated the local population, who could see that the Hollanders were landing and trying to conquer the area. And so John of Beaumont was also set upon by the locals with their makeshift weapons, and so was unable to advance to help Willem because he was busy fighting off the locals. Meanwhile, things were getting really dire for Willem and his knights. The Frisians had managed to actually separate Willem and some 500 of his best men from the rest of the contingent, who leaderless started to make their way back towards the sea. Meanwhile, Willem and these men that were cut off were picked off one by the Frisians coming in and taking them down. And it's in this scenario that we can imagine one by one these knights sinking into the mud with the Frisians clambering all over them, and eventually Willem too is knocked to the ground and hacked to death by the Frisians. We can sort of imagine this in a way like the scenes at Agincourt, where the dismounted French knights were also ploughing through these, the ploughed land, and so the mud, and were completely weighed down, while it appears that the English archers, without armour on and with knives and mallets and that kind of thing, were able to take advantage of them. It's a very similar situation by the sounds of things here at the Battle of Warns, and we actually know this from the way that the Frisians fought. While there may have been some knights leading the Frisians, most of the Frisians would not have been knights and would not have been wearing any armour at all. Quite a few accounts from the Middle Ages of Frisian fighters describe them as being naked, which probably doesn't literally mean naked, but rather that they were unarmoured or had very light clothes on when in battle. We know something about the kinds of weapons they were using as well from manuscript depictions, as well as from some other sources. We can see one of the most famous ones here. It's a kind of spear that has a sort of trident on the bottom. It's called kletsi in the old Frisian language, and the kletsi is used both as a spear but also as a vaulting pole to go over streams and bodies of water that aren't too wide, and so be able to attack in this manner. This meant that the Frisians were incredibly mobile because they weren't wearing armour and so could move more easily, remembering of course that the terrain in Fryslân, and specifically around the Reaklif, is incredibly marshy terrain. There's a lot of mud and silt, and something that's easy to slip into if you're wearing heavy armour, as the Hollanders and their allies were. However, the unarmoured Frisians, probably barefoot as well, because we know that the Frisians were often described as being barefoot, and this is a practice that survived in a lot of areas in Frisia for several centuries. Until the 19th century, as on some of the Frisian islands, it seems that they had much better grip on this muddy ground with their bare feet, and were able to move around it much better with these kletsi, which they could then also use as weapons. And here again we have an image from a church in Groningen showing some of these Frisian fighters. We also note, for instance, their hairstyles. A contemporary of the Frisians who noted how the Frisians fought on crusade mentioned also that they flew into battle. We might not be thinking of planes, of course, but rather these jumping sticks that they were using. We also have references that they completely shaved their heads apart from one tuft of hair. And we can also see in this image that they are using some kletsi as throwing weapons and others indeed as spears, as well as using swords and fighting barefoot. So perhaps this is how we should imagine the Frisian armies fighting the more traditional knights as we find them elsewhere in Europe on the Hollandic side. In any case, these Frisians proved to be more than a match for the veteran knights and crusaders that Willem had brought with him, and they appear to have made very short work of both Willem and, following his death, of the remainder of his knights, who fled into the sea and were chased into the sea by the Frisians, who we can imagine going after them. Some of these knights will have drowned in the water or in the mud, and others will indeed have been caught by the pursuing Frisians and murdered in various ways as they tried to escape. Now that the Frisian army had dealt with Willem and the main body of troops, they rounded back and attacked the remainder of the forces led by John of Beaumont, who, hearing that Willem had been cut down and that the Frisians were advancing on his position, went and gave them battle but was also defeated, although he managed a more orderly retreat than Willem had and was able to get back in the ships and sail back to Amsterdam, although it is noted that hardly any of the Hollanders made it back to Holland and that most indeed met their end at the hands of the Frisians and in the waters of the Zuiderzee. Subsequent lists of all the noblemen from Holland, Flanders and France that died at the battle are really quite astounding. Many of them seem to have been killed, and it did cause something of a crisis in all three of the counties in which Willem had been the head of state. These were of course Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut, and all of these were left without a ruler because Willem hadn't produced an heir before he'd been killed by the Frisians. On the other hand, it meant for Middle Frisia that it was safe from a period of Hollandic expansion because Holland itself was brought into a period of civil war between the Hoekse and Kabeljauwse factions, which would tear Holland apart for several decades before they would once again be able to try and attack the Frisians. They would, however, become another part in a Frisian story in that of the Frisian Civil War, one of the more famous attempts by the Hollanders to get involved and to seize control in 1421. But that is not for this video, that is in fact for a future video that I'm currently working on in connection with someone very special who is not from New Zealand but is from Fryslân, and more on that in the future. But for now, important that in 1951, so quite a while after that date, that the Battle of Warns once again became an important place for the Frisians of the 20th century, as there was erected there a large rock with 1345 and with the phrase "Leverder als slaaf," which means in English better to be dead than a slave, and that in the meantime has become a very important phrase for Frisians, particularly in connection with that Frisian freedom that I mentioned and the idea that the Frisians weren't ruled over by a feudal overlord. And that really is something that is quite important to a lot of Frisians today, whether they associate it particularly with the battle or not, but culturally it has taken on quite a lot of significance there. 6 years earlier, in 1945, was the first time that the Battle of Warns had actually been commemorated in an organised way. Of course, 1945 was the year in which the vast majority of the northern Netherlands was freed from German occupation, and so many Frisian nationalists at the time, now that they were once again free, decided to do more with the Frisian cultural identity and the language identity. And so from 1945, that year was of course 600 years after the battle had been fought, and yearly commemorations were held at Reaklif, meaning that it became a very important site for the Frisians of today, because quite possibly if the Hollanders had succeeded, then they would have gone on to conquer the rest of Fryslân and incorporated it into that county, which potentially means the Frisian language will have lost its status as being the language of an independent state, and that more people would have gone over to speaking Dutch or Low Saxon, which might possibly have meant that we wouldn't have a Frisian-speaking province at this point. It's very hard to tell if that would have happened, or if the army would have been defeated somewhere else by the Frisians, or that wouldn't have had an impact on the language, but still it remains an important milestone in the cultural heritage. And so even today, and by today I do literally mean today when this video comes out, there has been another remembrance at this site, and these pictures were actually taken there today. And as you can see, Frisians from all parts of Frisia have come to Reaklif outside of Starum at the site of Warns to celebrate this Frisian victory and the Frisian cultural identity, with music, poetry and several lectures and speeches being held by various Frisian individuals on Frisian topics as well. So this has been my video on the Battle of Warns from 1345 and what that meant for the Frisian people and why it's become so significant for Frisians today. If you'd like to hear the story of the Battle of Warns sung in Frisian, then I would highly recommend taking a listen to
Baldrs Draumar's song Slag By Warns, which is all about that battle and is told in a really interesting way, a really nice way. I think I've translated the lyrics into English for any people who don't understand Frisian in the description of, not in the description of the video, in the comments of that video, so I will link it below if you want to find out. Let me know if you enjoyed the Frisian content on the channel. I'll probably be doing quite a bit more, seeing as though I've had a few requests from people, and indeed more to come on the Frisian Civil War and more regular uploads in the future. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Give it a share, give it a like, and remember, Fryslân boppen en oor in de groppen. Sorry Willem.